First of all, thank you all for coming. Welcome to tonight's lecture. The lecture is, as you know, sponsored by the Human Rights Program on Arendt Center here at Bard. And we're really thrilled to have tonight Susie Linfield to talk to us. Some of you have seen or heard about her book, Cruel Radiance, Photography and Political Violence. It's a really thrilling book to read, and I encourage you to all, after tonight, if you don't have it already, to go and get a copy and take some time to read through it. Susie Linfield is an associate professor of journalism and the director of the Cultural Reporting and Criticism program at New York University, just down the river. She was formerly the arts editor of the Washington Post and the deputy editor of the Village Voice and the editor-in-chief of American Film. The book has gotten a lot of attention, deservedly so. It's a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Jed Pearl in the New Republic recently wrote that Linfield's new book is a beautifully considered and unabashedly impassioned plea for the continued moral relevance of photojournalism. For those of us in the Human Rights Program, thinking about the moral relevance of photojournalism, and for those of us in the Arendt Center thinking about lies and truth, this is a great opportunity. So I welcome Susie.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate that. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I'm going to read from some sections of the second chapter of my book, which is called The Calamity of the Kodak, which is a phrase of Mark Twain's that I can explain later if people are interested. And I'm also going to add some updated comments in reference to current political events, especially in the last couple of weeks in the Mideast. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
I'm sure many of you are familiar with Walter Benjamin's famous statement, "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." When it comes to photography, the opposite is also true. Every image of barbarism, of immiseration, humiliation, terror, extermination, embraces its opposite, though sometimes unknowingly. Every image of suffering says not only, "This is so," but also, by implication, "This must not be." Not only, "This goes on," but also, by implication, "This must stop." Documents of suffering are documents of protest. They show us what happens when we unmake the world. That is the dialectic and the hope at the heart of the photograph of suffering. But lodged within that dialectic and that hope is a complicating, devastating paradox. There is no doubt, despite the claims of critics such as Bertolt Brecht, Susan Sontag, and Alan Sekula, that photography has, more than any other 20th century medium, protested violence to billions of people all over the globe. Yet the history of photography also shows just how limited, how inadequate such protests are. Seeing does not necessarily translate into believing, understanding, caring, or acting. That is the dialectic and the failure at the heart of the photograph of suffering. Picture lights. This is a photograph that was taken by a Danish photographer, Ulla Jansen, at the Bangladesh Medical College, which is the only place in that country that treats women who have been victims of acid attacks by their husbands for filing for divorce or by unhappy suitors for refusing arranged marriages. And I should say this is, of the series of pictures that he took, this is the least grueling and the least gruesome. Okay. What then is photography's role in revealing injustice, fighting exploitation, and furthering human rights? Photojournalists have been key creators and disseminators of what the historian Samuel Moyn called, quote, the spectacle of blood fastened on extravagant bodily violation and pain, end quote. What, if anything, is there to show for this century-long parade of grim images? And why is there, especially in the present moment, such a backlash against these photographs? But first, another question. I think my book is better at posing questions than answering them. Another question. Why are photographs so good at making us see cruelty? Partly, I think, because photographs bring home to us the reality of physical suffering with a literalness and an irrefutability that neither literature nor painting can claim. The Uruguayan essayist Eduardo Galeano observed, after viewing a photograph by Sebastião Salgado, quote, hunger looks like the man that hunger is killing. The very thing that critics have assailed photographs for not doing, explaining causation, process, political contradictions, is connected to the very thing they do so well, present us to ourselves and each other as bodily creatures. Photographs reveal how the human body is the original site of reality, in Elaine Scarry's words. The body is our primary truth, our inescapable fate. Which is precisely what Jean Amoret learned, to his never-ending amazement, when he faced his Gestapo torturers. All those attributes that a man might think of as, quote, his soul or his mind or his consciousness or his identity are destroyed when there is that cracking and splintering in the shoulder joints, Amoret later wrote. Torture, and later Auschwitz, taught Amoret, a proud intellectual, just how real his body was. Photographs show us how easily we are reduced to the merely physical, which is to say how easily the body can be maimed, starved, splintered, beaten, burnt, torn, stabbed, and crushed. Photographs present us, in short, with physical cruelty and our vulnerability to it. The vulnerability is something that every human being shares. The cruelty is something that shatters our very sense of what it means to be human. As the Iraqi human rights activist Kanan Rakia wrote, quote, the violation of the human body has a visceral, irrational, and irrevocable quality about it. It is the bedrock under all the layers of horrible things that human beings do to one another. But documentary photography's ability to confront us with powerful images of suffering, images that we cannot always understand or master, has been the subject of vitriolic attacks from a range of critics. This can be traced back to the Weimar era, certainly one of modernity's most traumatic periods, and to some of the Weimar critics and artists, particularly Siegfried Kracauer, Walter Benjamin, and especially Brecht. But it's particularly in the post-World War II period that photographs depicting violence and poverty, especially in the so-called Third World, have been denounced as patronizing, imperialist, and racist. Writing of the photograph of a starving Sudanese child, for instance, anthropologists Arthur and Joan Kleinman charged, quote, the image of the subaltern conjures up an almost neo-colonial ideology of failure, inadequacy, passivity, fatalism, and inevitability, end quote. Many others have echoed such claims. In particular, the charge of pornography is freely bandied about when it comes to photographs of suffering. In a mid-1970s essay, Alan Sekula derided what he called, quote, the pornography of the direct representation of misery. 25 years later, Sontag restated this truism, quote, all images that display the violation of an attractive body are, to a certain degree, pornographic, she wrote. Countless other critics and would-be critics have used this terminology, Indeed, pornographic photography has become a stock phrase with numerous iterations. Thus, war photography is casually described and dismissed as war porn, while in the humanitarian aid world, photographs of the poor and vulnerable are decried as development pornography. Jørgen Listner, a Danish humanitarian worker, summed up this outlook when he charged that the photograph of an African famine victim is a kind of, quote, social pornography because it exposes something in human life that is as delicate and deeply personal as sexuality, that is, suffering, end quote. The use of the term pornography is not totally inapt, but it expresses an essential confusion. Pornography strikes many viewers as a betrayal, not an expression of human sexuality. Pornography reveals something that strangers should not see, and whose worth is diminished when they do. But photographs of suffering people, of the body in pain, are something quite different. They are the revelation of something that ought not exist. One can argue that sex should remain private. When it comes to torture, exploitation, and cruelty, however, privacy is an integral part of the problem. Other weaknesses in the pornography argument abound. Not all pornography is bad, that is, exploitative, degrading, or violent, which is why its use as an epithet makes little sense. Nor is it obvious that a child starving to death is deeply personal and private, or rather, only deeply personal and private, in the sense that making love usually is. On the contrary, famine is, by definition, a shared condition, as are many other kinds of misery and grief. War, we might say, is the collectivization of anguish. What is wrong with revealing such suffering? What is right with hiding it? Why is the teller, rather than the tale, considered obscene? And in any case, aren't some of the world's obscenities worthy of our attention? In fact, the term pornographic is now so widely and variously, dare I say promiscuously, summoned in discussions of documentary photography, that it is not at all clear how it can be a key to deeper understandings. It is used to describe a suspiciously wide variety of contradictory responses, too little concern for suffering, and a narcissistic identification with it, inappropriate numbing, and inappropriate excitement, lazy carelessness about the pain of others, and a creepy, overly intent focus on it. Indeed, I would argue that the term pornography, like the term Orientalism, is now used primarily as a weapon whose main job is to shame the accused and to stifle discussion. Ironically, those photographers who have worked hardest and most consciously to avoid objectifying their subjects are fiercely derided as pornographers and exploiters. James Nachtwey, perhaps the most prominent and controversial war photographer working today, is a prime target of such attacks. Here's a picture. This is a photograph that Nachtwey took of a starving man in the Sudan in 1993. The famines there, obviously, the result of the wars. Okay. So is Sebastião Salgado, the Brazilian photographer and former Marxist economist. He has spent decades documenting the Third World's peasants, manual workers, refugees, famine victims, and displaced people. The losers in globalization's great game, as David Reef put it. Salgado's subjects work on stony farms and jungle plantations, on ships and railroads, in factories, on oil rigs, in diamond and coal mines. Most of them are inconceivably poor. Yet Salgado imbues his subjects with an unflagging respect that borders on reverence. These people may be losers, but he praises them like famous men. He has, in essence, visualized the labor theory of value and personalized it too. The unapologetic, forthright people in his portraits command our attention as equals, not subalterns. This is a Salgado picture of a cacao worker in Bahia, Brazil. Some left-wing writers, especially overseas, admire Salgado. In this country, his press is often less favorable, and his photographs have been attacked as, quote, offensive, embarrassing, kitschy, meretricious, insulting, and even unforgivable. Disparaging Salgado is the sine qua non of intellectual sophistication. He has been castigated by critics such as Ingrid Sischig, Sontag, and Luc Sontag. Salgado's photos are, of course, flawed. They can be criticized for a kind of sentimentality and grandiosity. And unlike a photographer like Gil Perez, Salgado does not make us question what we know or how we know. This is a Gil Perez photo taken in 1979. This is a demonstration by victims of the Shah's torture. Typically, I know some of you have Gil, I think, as a professor, a typically challenging and hard to understand, or certainly not easy to understand photo. Salgado does not make us question what we know or how we know, but the exaggerated vitriol that photographers such as Salgado and Naqvi inspire demonstrates, I think, a fierce animus against the very possibility that beauty, which is to say dignity, tenderness, and grace, can thrive amongst the poor. This fear has led to the advocacy of an insultingly slumming aesthetic. Craft, care, structure, and visual power are now morally suspect in photojournalism, while sloppiness somehow denotes authenticity and a good heart. The writer Jim Lewis proclaimed in Slate, quote, I really don't think that a picture of an atrocity should be a good picture, a beautiful picture, a well-composed picture. It should be casually composed, hastily framed, and only competently printed, end quote. It is as if we, the relatively safe and well-off, can atone for our good fortune only by delving into the visual equivalent of sackcloth and ashes. If a picture seems sloppy, it's okay to look. But this is the aesthetic not of respect, but of guilt. It confuses moral weight with aesthetic clumsiness, and it is more concerned with the clear conscience of the viewer than with the plight of the injured subject. This animus against looking has thrust contemporary photojournalists into a catch-22. Some are criticized for taking too beautiful pictures, while others are chided for images that are too ugly to bear. Some are criticized for a gruesome realism, while others are accused of being overly romantic in their approach. Viewers, too, are at fault. Critics have told audiences that our reactions are too harsh or too delicate, needlessly complex or laughably simple, gushing with sentiment or devoid of feeling. We are voyeurs, or we are uncaring, or perhaps we are uncaring voyeurs. The problem is not that some of these charges are unfair. On the contrary, all of them are sometimes true. The problem is that making and looking at pictures that portray suffering will always be a highly imperfect and highly impure activity, perhaps even an impossible one. Theodor Adorno captured this paradox, this no exit, in which all art and all representation find themselves when they attempt to show the unshowable or speak the unspeakable. Writing of Schoenberg's 1946 cantata, A Survivor from Warsaw, Adorno observed, quote, "The victims are turned into works of art, tossed out to be gobbled up by the world that did them in. The so-called artistic rendering of the naked physical pain of those who were beaten down with rifle butts contains, however distantly, the possibility that pleasure can be squeezed from it. The unthinkable becomes transfigured, something of its horror removed. By this alone an injustice is done the victims." But then he added, "Yet no art that avoided the victims could stand up to the demands of justice." Rather than confront this difficulty, contemporary critics dismiss problematic images as pornographic and launch ad hominem attacks against photojournalists, as if this will absolve us of the need to look, to see, to think, to confront, and to act. It is a contemporary truism, indeed a contemporary cliché, that photographs of suffering desensitize us. The plethora of awful images has, apparently, taken the sting out of horror. Sontag's warning that photographs deaden conscience has been echoed many times. Countless writers have blamed photojournalism for the creation of so-called compassion fatigue. Indeed, to dispute this idea is akin to repudiating evolution or joining the Flat Earth Society. And yet I think the desensitization argument is exactly wrong. For most of history, for thousands of years, most people have known little and cared less about the suffering of those who are unknown or alien. Rousseau observed, quote, "The feeling of humanity evaporates and grows feeble in embracing all mankind. It is proper that our humanity should confine itself to our fellow citizens," end quote. In Rousseau's time, and for many centuries before Rousseau's time, it was the family, the clan, the tribe, the ethnic group, the religious community, or the nation that mattered most. In our time, that is still true. The only difference is that today, in a few parts of the world, those outside one's immediate circle of concern sometimes matter too. For a small but growing minority, the conviction that we are morally and practically connected to the suffering of others is the pillar of political and moral identity. And it is this camera, the still camera, the movie camera, the video camera, and now the digital camera, that has done so much to globalize our consciences. It is the camera that brought us the 20th century's bad news. Today it is quite simply impossible to say, "I did not know." Photographs have robbed us of the alibi of ignorance. We know of suffering in far-flung parts of the world in ways that our forebears never could, and the images that we see in some places, under some conditions, demand not just our interest, but our response. Far from dulling our senses, photography has been a key component in the creation of what rights theorist Mary Kaldor has called our growing consciousness of what it means to be human. Try to imagine, if only for a moment, what your intellectual, political, and ethical world would be like if you had never seen a photograph. Sentiment, that boogaboo of Brecht and Sontag, has been central in making this visual encounter with strangers matter. For it is the opportunity and the ability to be moved by the plight of others, to understand that they hurt too, and to feel responsible to that understanding, that has made a great difference in the creation of a human rights consciousness. When Richard Rorty posed the question, quote, "Why should I care about a person whose habits I find disgusting?" He suggested that the best answer might be, quote, because her mother would grieve for her. The camera has been a key tool, perhaps the key tool, in enabling such empathic leaps. Lights, please. This is a picture that was taken last year by Martin Beesdale of the Seven Collective. This is a girl in the Democratic Republic of Congo who was captured by the Lord's Resistance Army of Uganda. Her lips and ears were cut off and she was left for dead, but was rescued. This was taken at a hospital in the DR. Not that photographs stop atrocities, much less prevent them. Our innocence on that front ended long ago. The belief in the saving power of exposure, qua exposure, can no longer be sustained. And yet photography has been central to fostering the idea, if not yet the reality, that human rights abuses are no longer the private property of the states or the non-state actors that commit them. It is impossible to imagine transnational groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or Doctors Without Borders in the pre-photographic age. Of course, the internationalism of the camera may not be the internationalism that socialists and communists dreamed of for almost 200 years. It puts far more emphasis on the actions of bystanders than on those of the oppressed, and it dangerously conflates political crises with humanitarian ones. But it is the morality and the internationalism that we often have. There is a kind of photograph that the early optimistic practitioners of photojournalism could not have imagined. Photographs that celebrate cruelty rather than condemn it. Such pictures are, alas, far from rare. In the United States, thousands of photographs of lynchings were taken. They show black men, bludgeoned, swollen, burnt, castrated, as they sway, necks broken, on twisted ropes hung from trees. And they show, too, the crowds of white celebrants and their children. The Nazis and their supporters took millions of photographs. Indeed, the vast majority of the images that we have of the Holocaust, including some of the most searing, were taken by Nazis. Lights. This is a photograph that was taken by a Nazi soldier named Heinrich Jost. Like many soldiers stationed in Warsaw, he would often go into the Warsaw ghetto on his day off to look at the happenings and take pictures. This is a photograph he took in 1941. This one is obviously selling armbands. Jost had been an amateur photographer before the war. He kept these pictures hidden for many years, and they were eventually published, actually first in Israel and then in Germany. Saddam Hussein's Baathists documented some of their tortures, rapes, and executions in photographs and films. Members of Sierra Leone's Revolutionary United Front, famed for creating a nation of cripples, photographed themselves in the act of committing atrocities. The Scorpions, a notorious Serb paramilitary group, filmed themselves as they executed unarmed Bosnian Muslims. The resulting tape was bought by a journalist in an ordinary video store in Serbia. All these images, and there are many, many more, undermine the basic tenet of photojournalism, the belief that perpetrators seek to hide the crimes they commit, and that exposing those crimes will lead to saving action or to justice. Officials in Stalin's prisons, and Pol Pot's too, photographed some of their prisoners before they were executed. These photographs are among the most important and worst documents of the 20th century. And while these prison pictures are not obviously examples of typical photojournalism, they reveal the great strengths and weaknesses of photographs of suffering. They were taken by perpetrators, yet they speak for the victims and are on the side of the victims. They sabotage their own intent. They are scalding self-accusations. They twist in upon themselves. But they also epitomize, in especially cruel ways, the inability of photographs to save the people they depict. One devastating set of such images can be found in David King's book, Ordinary Citizens, a collection of portraits of Stalin's political prisoners, a category that was extraordinarily capacious. The setting is Moscow's Lubyanka prison. Most of the photographs, which are grainy and tightly framed, date from the 1930s. All of the prisoners had been convicted in sham trials. All would be shot, even on the same day of their trials. Their so-called crimes included sabotage, terrorism, ties to the Gestapo, or alternately to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and of course, Trotskyite deviations. Though taken under hideous conditions for hideous purposes, these are portraits rather than hurried mugshots. The jailers used cameras that required long exposure times, and they depended on natural light, not flashbulbs. These are slow pictures, the opposite of snapshots. And so there is time for a panoply of reactions and for the victims' characters to emerge. Each Soviet citizen faced imminent death as herself, bringing to this moment all that had gone before. This is a picture of Ekterina Zakharova. She was a farm worker accused of espionage. She was executed in 1931, 4 days after her trial. And she was later, for what it's worth, rehabilitated in the Gorbachev era. The prisoners of Pol Pot's regime were even more wretched than their Russian predecessors. And in Tuol-Sleng prison, they too were photographed before execution. A small selection of the resulting 5,000 photos was collected in a 1996 book called The Killing Fields. And you can find many, many more of these photographs on the website of Yale's Cambodian Genocide Project. Tuol-Sleng, also known as S-21, in Tuol-Sleng, presumed enemies of the state were interrogated, tortured, starved, and killed, often by having their heads smashed. Trials, even the cosmetic kind, were unheard of. The prisoners' alleged crimes include working for the CIA, hiding rice, and, quote, being fond of freedom. S-21 was a great success. Of the estimated 14,000 prisoners it received between 1975 and 1979, only 7 are known to have survived. Even after studying Ordinary Citizens, the S-21 photographs are a shock. There is simply no way to prepare for them. Many of the condemned had just arrived, blindfolded, at the prison, and had no idea where they were or why. Some are chained to other prisoners and beaten. Illuminated by harsh light or flashes, which lends these pictures a stark, flat, weirdly pure look. Faces of alarm, terror, and exhaustion stare out at us. And sometimes, astonishingly, faces of self-possession and poise present themselves too. The S-21 administration kept extensive records, but the victims, at least in this book, are unidentified. This absence of information makes the photographs more brutal. The disorientation of the prisoners is deepened by the lacunae that surround them. As opposed to the Soviet photos, there are no names, addresses, occupations, party affiliations, or even lists of crimes or dates of death. There is virtually nothing to tell us who these people used to be. Now they are close to pure victims. And yet, even so, each person here, too, is singular. Perhaps that was their ultimate and only victory. Many women were arrested and photographed with their babies who would also be murdered. This photograph, actually, you can see the date of that the picture was taken. But the most stunning thing here is the parade of children photographed on their own. Children who would be tortured and killed as counter-revolutionary enemies, such as the girl who is pictured here. To stare at her as she stares at us is, I think, to enter into an abyss. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Adorno wrote, quote, "The need to lend a voice to suffering is a condition of all truth," end quote. The Lubyanka and S-21 photographs make clear, again, the utter necessity and the utter inadequacy of all such voices. And this is true whether those voices take verbal or visual forms, whether they are shouts or whispers, strong or strangled, whether they are willingly articulated or, as with the Soviet and Cambodian photos, produced through force. Verbal description, testimony, visual documentation, each falls short in the wake of these insane slaughters. Mercy, when it was needed, was absent. Reason, when it was called for, disappeared. These are the facts to confront, and these are the facts that resist confrontation. To look at these pictures is necessary, but its only guarantee is failure. Here, surely, is the grief beyond healing of which the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah wrote. Nor is simple identification with the victims possible. At the end of the killing fields, historian David Chandler wrote, quote, "Visiting the photographs in this book, we may be coming face to face with our shadow selves. We are inside S-21. We become interrogators, prisoners, and passers-by," end quote. I think that the opposite is true. One can mourn the people in Lubyanka and S-21. One must mourn, know what happened and when and how. But that should not be mistaken for closeness. We are not inside those prisons. They were. Our hells almost certainly are not theirs. Nor should the difference between looking at a photograph and torturing a child be quite so easily blurred. To confuse the torturer with his prey, much less believe that you have somehow become one or the other, is not an expression of solidarity. It is instead an evasion of the immense, insurmountable difficulties, the inability to understand, the inability to grieve, the inability to act that these photographs present. That is not an argument for not looking, not seeing, or not knowing, nor for throwing one's hands up and turning away. Looking at these doomed people is not a form of exploitation. Forgetting them is not a form of respect. But it would be good to avoid a knowledge that is easy, an identification that is glib, and a resolution that is cheap. Neither humanism nor history will bridge the chasm between us viewers and the girl we see here. We cannot become her, switch places with her, or reach back into history to save her. We are simply too late. The demands of justice about which Adorno wrote will never, can never, be met, and the suffering of the victims will never be redeemed. The earliest photojournalists expected images of injustice to push viewers into action. Photographs were regarded not as expressions of alienation, but as interventions in the world. Delia Falconer's elegiac novel, The Service of Clouds, published in 1997, expresses this hope beautifully. The protagonist, a woman photographer in early 20th century Australia, ends the book by telling us, quote, "I have thought, if I find the right place, the right quality of light, I might take photographs so painful that they make people want to look away, and then that they will feel the urge to enter and put right the world they represent." To turn from the image and repair the world. This is the photographic ideal that still lives today. But like so many ideals, it has been chastened by experience. Now we know that pictures of affliction can be easily ignored, or even worse, enjoyed. Now we know the fatal gaps that exist between seeing, caring, and acting. And so the important question when we think about photography and human rights is not how many images we see or how brutal or explicit or pornographic they are. Nor can we blame photography for having failed to vanquish violence. As James Nachtwey once pointed out, quote, "The greatest statesmen, philosophers, humanitarians have not been able to put an end to war. Why place that demand on photography?" So the real issue is how we use these images. Can they help us to make meaning of the present and the past? If so, what meanings do we make, and how do we act upon them? The ultimate answers to such questions reside not in the pictures, but in ourselves. Photojournalists are responsible for the ethics of showing, but we are responsible for the ethics of seeing. This requires transforming our relationship to photographs from one of passivity, complaint, and cynicism to one of creativity and collaboration. And it means regarding the violators of human rights, not the photographers who document them, as the real agents of exploitation and death. Roland Barthes once described photographers as agents of death. It may be as hard for us to understand our new chaotic visual environment as it was for Weimar citizens to master theirs. We are as conflicted as were Benjamin and Krakauer. Images flood into our world in the old ways, through the printed press, films, and television, but also through cell phones, iPods, satellite dishes, social networking sites, and the internet. How to respond? Anxieties abound, and for good reason. On the internet, all photographs are equal, including doctored, manipulated, or constructed photographs, and those without any meaningful or with entirely false contexts. Thus, the critic Andy Grunberg has warned that, quote, "The liberty of an unchecked image environment may prove to be less a blessing than a subtle form of tyranny, and the democracy of the camera may prove to be a perverse kind of fascism," end quote. Certainly the new visual technologies have changed the relationship between information, propaganda, and war. The Taliban, for instance, which used to ban photographs, movies, and television as ungodly, now has its own video production unit, which posts its advertisements for jihad, its videos of suicide bombings and beheadings on the web. So does Al-Qaeda. Yet, as Jed Pearl and many others have argued, digital photography and the internet might also herald unprecedented possibilities for new, more egalitarian forms of visual participation and be a boon to human rights activists everywhere. If digital photography has made viewers more skeptical about the reality quotient of photographs, just what the postmodern critics had hoped, it has also made the making, transmitting, and seeing of pictures incomparably easier, cheaper, and more accessible than ever before, and has given rise to all sorts of organizations, Photo Voice, Pixel Press, there are many of them, that use photography and film as part of their human rights work. The inspiring and sometimes bloody photographs we saw from the 2009 Iranian protests, and more recently from Tunisia and Egypt, lend credence to the optimistic pro-democracy interpretation of the new media. Many of those photographs, especially from Iran, were taken by non-professionals on their cell phones, then quickly circulated all over the world. One could find them everywhere, from major newspapers to Facebook. Yet the techno-utopianism these photographs have prompted, some writers have hailed these movements as Twitter revolutions, YouTube revolutions, or Facebook revolutions, strikes me as premature, if not vastly overblown. Frank Rich recently noted, correctly, that this analysis is itself a form of Western chauvinism. In Iran, it was the old-fashioned forces, the old-fashioned guns of the police, the Revolutionary Guards, and the army that determined the outcome, as they did, to a large extent, though to opposite effect, in Tunisia and Egypt. Indeed, the Iranian movement has launched into a painful self-critique of its reliance on the internet. After the failed call for a massive turnout in the so-called Trojan horse demonstration of last February, one Iranian blogger wondered, where were the Greens of Tehran? Then he answered, quote, we were on the internet reading about the Trojan horse plan. We were on YouTube learning about the action. We were chatting online in the afternoon about where we should have met in the morning. And two can play the technology game. The Iranian police have used electronic trails left by activists to track down thousands of regime opponents. And according to Human Rights Watch, the Iranian government has created an online surveillance center and is believed to be behind a cyber army of hackers that it can unleash against opponents. Since the 2009 revolt, Iran's courtrooms have hosted numerous show trials. Its jails have filled with political prisoners. Charges of rape and other state-sponsored tortures abound, and executions continue. Twitter is not an adequate response to the power of the state. And I'm sure you all saw what happened in Tehran and other Iranian cities yesterday. So at the risk of sounding old-fashioned, I would argue that social media, indeed any media, can never replace political parties, political strategies, political programs, or political leadership. The new danger, I fear, is that information freedom will become synonymous with, that is, become a substitute for, real political and civic freedom. It might behoove us to remember that the medium isn't the message is the message. Iran taught us, and I suspect so will Tunisia and Egypt and Lebanon and Yemen and many other places to come, that democratic images can inspire a democracy and strengthen a democracy, but they cannot create one. Only people working in solidarity with each other can ever do that. Thank you. questions, I actually have 4 other images if people want to see them. Yes, okay. These are 4 very controversial images. They're a series of pictures. The conditions under which they were taken are very controversial. The fact that they were taken is controversial. Looking at them has proved controversial. And the fact that they won one of the World Press Photo Awards is controversial. They were taken by a Somali photographer named Farah Abdi Warsama, who works in Somalia for the AP. They show the stoning to death of a man named Muhammad Abubakar Ibrahim for the crime of adultery. The stoning was carried out by a fundamentalist Muslim group called Hizbul Islam, which has now allied itself with the main fundamentalist militia, Al-Shabaab, which essentially controls the country now. I should say that Sharia is now legal in Somalia. So far as I know, what we are about to see in these 4 pictures is not a crime. And I know there's a lot of debate right now about making certain kinds of deals with the Taliban in Afghanistan, etc., and a possible reintroduction of Sharia law. And so it's useful, I think, to look at these pictures, not that they can decide that debate, but certainly as something to keep in mind. Part of what's so controversial about these pictures, although not to me, but to some others, is the fact that they could only have been taken with the approval, in fact, under the directive of the militia. In other words, these are not underground photos. These are photos that the militia wanted to be taken. They have circulated around the world in many different ways. And I suspect that they are being used by Al-Shabaab and the other militias as a form of propaganda, as a form of celebration, although we, I think, would see them in another way. So this is the first one with the victim being buried. This is the second one. You can see these are the stones that are being thrown. They're quite huge. His head is down here. Just hold on. And you can see a lot of people watch this. You can see them in the background. There's apparently quite a large crowd. The third one is quite horrible. This is the victim. I'm not sure if he is still alive. Being dragged out. And the last one, you see him dead. I don't know if that's another stone about to be thrown or a kind of celebration. This photographer is still working in Somalia and has actually been doing some very admirable work. Okie doke.
We have some type of questions here.
Fire away. Yes.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit more. You mentioned the ethics of showing versus the ethics of seeing.
Yeah.
And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the ethics of showing. It's funny that at the very end you mentioned that some of those photos had won awards, because I wanted to ask what you thought of awards being held for those types of photos and the kind of requisites, whether or not they're different technical aspects of the photos or the content themselves and how that's judged. But that in relation to the responsibility of the photographer and the ethics of showing, if you could sort of expand on that.
I don't know how those awards are given. This was in the news category, as you might imagine, not the art category. Personally, I think it's really good that those photos were taken, and I think it's really important for people to look at them. The fact that they are also used as propaganda, as for instance for many Nazi photos, to me is irrelevant. I mean, one of the important and interesting and also confusing things about photographs, I think, is that the intention of the photographer is only a part of the photo. In other words, the photographer might intend one thing, but we, the viewer, might see very different things. So the Heinrich Jost photo of the woman in the Warsaw Ghetto, I think that we see that photo, or at least I see that photo in a way very, very different than I think Heinrich Jost intended that photo to be seen. He was not an opponent of the Nazi regime by any stretch of the imagination, although I am, and I suspect most people here are. So what I meant is that a lot of photography criticism tends to whine a lot about the imperfections of the photograph. It's too voyeuristic, it's too much of a spectacle, it does this, it doesn't do that. And some of those criticisms in some cases can be valid, but I think that too much of the emphasis is on what the photographer intended or didn't intend, and what the photographer has or hasn't succeeded in doing. And what I was suggesting is that it behooves us, the viewers, to take more responsibility, that we're not just passive recipients of the photograph. The fact that those photographs of the stoning were, in a sense, commissioned by the militia who carried out this murder doesn't mean that we might not see them and use them in a very, very different way, so that we can be more active viewers, I think, than we often are. And that's what I meant about how the ethics of seeing are our responsibility. I don't know if that answers your question. In terms of awards, I don't know. People work hard, and I think it's fine for them to get awards. I have no problem with those photographs receiving an award. I don't think they were awarded for their technical proficiency. I think they were awarded for what they show, and also it takes a lot of guts for the photographer to have put himself in that situation. Those could not have been easy pictures to take by any stretch of the imagination. He's working in Somalia, one of the worst places on earth. If he got an award, I think that's fine. Other questions?
But that kind of
Yes.
That kind of contradicts a little what you were saying, because the guts and the courage and the sentiment of the photographer surely should not be the prime way in which that we judge the photographs. There were very different photographs that you showed, but you didn't offer many terms through which we could analyze them as precisely as you would like us to. And I don't think that those who use terms such as pornography and Orientalism, the comparison of which in New York 2011 is a little tenuous. I don't think that they make it quite as easy on themselves as you claim. For example, Susan Sontag, in Regarding the Pain of Others, she retracts the desensitizing hypothesis, and
she does.
Complicates it in many ways, just as most of the people that you quoted do. I don't know, I've never quite seen the debate painted in such stark black and white colors as in this lecture.
Yeah.
So it's a little confusing.
Well, let me answer. You're saying a few things. I'll try to answer at least some of them. I don't think the intent of the photographer is the only thing. I was talking specifically about the question of receiving the award. Sontag did take back some of what she said previously in her last book, although she reiterated some of it. But that book has, at least from my viewpoint of someone who reads and writes and talks to people, has not had, and this may not be her fault, but has not had even the minutest kind of effect that On Photography has. I mean, On Photography, which I do think is a very brilliant book in some ways, but really set the tone and set the direction of photography criticism for the next 25 years. So it is true that she retracted a few things, But it's also true that Marx in, Volume 3 of Capital said certain things, but the whole trajectory of his work is other than that, and the whole influence he had is, can't really be fastened on those few things he said in Volume 3. And so I think her last book is sort of like that. She retracted a few things, but, this may not at all be her fault, but the whole emphasis of photography criticism is very, very, very much towards these ideas of voyeurism, exploitation, desensitization. And although she did retract some things, she actually, I think, reiterated in a damaging way other things. What else were you asking?
Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that I don't see why a photograph cannot be pornographic and constructive. It can, the terms that you use, such as sentiment and empathy or certain humanity, I don't see why one has to create this stark opposition between those who accuse of pornography and exploitation and those who stand with the victims. I mean, why wouldn't Nachtwey profit from a workshop where people explain how his work is pornographic? Maybe that would do his work good. I don't see why there has to be this patrolling of time.
Yeah, as I said, I honestly don't know what the word pornographic means. To describe so many different kinds of photographs and so many different kinds of reactions that, to me anyway, it is not a term that elucidates. And I think that it is a term whose major function is really to shut down. As soon as you say that something is pornographic, it's sort of like accusing someone of being racist. It's a term that tends to shut down discussion. Among other things, I myself don't think that pornography is necessarily a bad thing. I'm not for banning pornography, so I'm not sure why calling a photograph pornographic is also is a bad thing, which I think it is meant to be. But the term to me is so loosely used and so used in such inopportune ways that, to me anyway, it doesn't elucidate anything, and I think that frankly it often substitutes for more careful thinking. Once we call something pornographic, that's it, and the discussion often doesn't go much further. Yes?
Do you think the term pornographic is being used as a shorthand to refer to the effects of the commodification of suffering? Because the suffering becomes commodified in the image is a commodity that is consumed. People in consuming the image, pay for whatever experience they get. And so do you think that when people are using the term, when they're throwing that, and I agree with what you're saying, that term tends to shut things down just as the way, unfortunately, the term Orientalist has come to operate. And I really appreciated that, actually. But do you think the term pornographic is being used as a shorthand, not to delve into the processes of commodification of suffering?
Well,
and
the word,
what that means when you're talking about suffering in a capitalist society.
Yeah. The word consume is one that is somewhat bewildering in some ways, because it is true that we consume images, but the alternative to that is to not consume images, i.e. to not look at them. So while consuming, again, it has a sort of dirty, Philistine, exploitative tinge to it. The alternative, which is somehow purer, of not consuming, is to me worse, because we do live in a capitalist society. That's the one we have all over the world now. And so to look or to not look. And part of what I'm saying is that both are very impure. I'm not arguing it is very impure to look at these photographs. They're terrible, and what's the right reaction? I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is that sometimes you look at images of victims, and instead of feeling empathy and all those solidarity, they're actually repulsive. Victimhood can be disgusting. So yes, we have many impure thoughts and feelings, but what I'm trying to argue is that it is far better to look and to explore those thoughts and feelings and delve into them rather than censor them and say, oh, that's pornographic, that's exploitative, that's racist, that's, and because I think that it's not that I think that feeling, our reactions are the end point, but I think that they can be a beginning point to really understanding our ideas and our thoughts about victimhood, about suffering, about being bystanders, about what we do, about what we don't do. And I think that photographs are a way into those issues. So what I would hope, and that's what I meant about the ethics of seeing, is that we learn to see in ways that are less censorious and yet at the same time less lazy. And that we do have all sorts of reactions, and that we plunge into those reactions and also plunge into the realities that we're looking at, plunge into the history and the reality of what's going on in Somalia, a country that has basically dropped off the face of the earth for the most part. So that's what I'm arguing. But yes, it is impure, and it is a kind of consumption, and we are all part of the capitalist monster. I don't know who stands outside of that. Yes?
I think it's that you are fostering kind of dichotomies. Maybe it's an academic dichotomy because photographs, there's not just two reactions to photographs that have a money shop, just like pornography, to create action. It's sort of an interesting word. And, like a word you used that I find strange in speaking about the history of the critique and the discussion of photography is calling these people, are you talking about Benjamin or Sontag, or there's whiners? I found that really a strange critique of critiquing photography in many subtle ways. There's not just seeing and reacting, and people see people falling down on the ground, and they don't even need photographs, and they don't react. But I appreciate the humanist intent, and we don't want to just go like, oh no, these are too pornographic to look at. But there's something a little too easy in just calling a critique of photography, because there's many problems, and it's very subtle, and it's very interesting, in fact. But to call people who critique a certain kind of pure reaction to cruelty, up to photographs of cruelty, to call them whiners. I had a little problem with that, as being just like pitting a lot of people who are interested in photography and what it does. No, I'm commenting.
Okay. Others, you had your hand up.
Yeah. You were talking about how people felt kind of alleviated some guilt to look at technically proficient images of things. And now these days, with like cell phones and everything, but there's a lot of events that happen where there's just images that come out, and it's not necessarily from someone saying, I'm going to take a picture of that